He was ordered to take photos, nothing more. But when Major Cowboy Stout looked down at the runway below, he didn't see an empty airfield. He saw 40 Japanese aircraft preparing to massacre thousands of Marines. In that moment, he had 30 seconds to choose, obey, or save an entire invasion. In early September 1944, the USS Hornet CV-12 moved steadily through the Western Pacific, part of a vast American naval presence preparing for the assault on Peleliu. The carrier had been operating almost constantly since its commissioning the previous year, supporting major operations across the Marianas and the Philippines. Its flight deck had become a familiar stage for the U.S. Navy's most experienced aviators, men who had survived the dangerous, high-tempo rhythm of carrier warfare. Among them was Major Robert W. Cowboy Stout, a 28-year-old Marine aviator temporarily operating from the Hornet. At an age when most U.S. fighter pilots were barely in their 20s, Stout stood out as something of a veteran. He had accumulated more than 60 combat missions across the Pacific, flying in conditions that routinely pushed pilots to the limits of endurance. His superiors regarded him as steady, disciplined, and reliable, a man trusted with missions that required precision rather than aggression. On September 12th, Stout was assigned what should have been one of the simplest tasks of his deployment, a reconnaissance mission over northern Peleliu. The invasion forced 28,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division was only days from landing. Planners needed confirmation that the island's main Japanese airfield was unusable. Pre-invasion intelligence assessments had concluded that Peleliu's air power had been neutralized by earlier bombing raids. The airfield, they believed, was abandoned. The mission brief reflected this confidence. Stout's orders were explicit: fly over the airfield, maintain altitude, and let the automatic reconnaissance camera mounted on his F6F Hellcat record the landscape below. No strafing, no bombing runs, no deviation from the flight path. The directive was standard for pre-invasion reconnaissance: collect evidence, avoid confrontation, and return with the film intact. On the flight deck that morning, the atmosphere was calm, almost routine. The crew prepared Stout's Hellcat with the practiced efficiency of a ship long accustomed to combat operations. Nothing in the briefing, the weather reports, or the intelligence summaries suggested that he might face immediate danger. Yet the Pacific War had repeatedly shown how easily assumptions could collapse in a single moment. Stout launched from the Hornet under the quiet expectation that this mission would be uneventful. The danger waiting beyond Peleliu's shoreline had not yet revealed itself. In 1944, as American forces pushed steadily across the Central Pacific, the island of Peleliu appeared on operational maps as a minor obstacle in a much larger campaign. Barely 6 miles long, covered in coral ridges and dense vegetation, Peleliu was part of the Palau archipelago, a strategic cluster of islands lying between the Philippines and the Western Caroline Islands. Its primary value rested on a single feature: the Japanese airfield on its northern plain. From this strip, the Imperial Japanese Navy could potentially launch aircraft against American operations. Moving toward the Philippines, neutralizing it became a priority in the wider plan to secure General Douglas MacArthur's return to Luzon. By late summer 1944, U.S. commanders believed the Peleliu airfield had been rendered effectively useless. Weeks of bombing by carrier aircraft had cratered the runway and damaged surrounding facilities. Pilots returning from these raids reported little visible activity, leading analysts to conclude that the Japanese had abandoned the position or withdrawn their remaining aircraft deeper into the Palaus. A series of optimistic intelligence summaries described the air threat as non-existent. These assessments circulated through headquarters, reinforcing confidence that Peleliu would pose little resistance from the air. That confidence was amplified by the rapid American advance elsewhere. Victories in the Marianas and the destruction of much of Japan's naval air arm in the Battle of the Philippine Sea led many planners to believe that Japanese aviation in the region had collapsed. Bureaucratic momentum carried these conclusions forward. Once the threat was categorized as low, few questioned the assumption. The focus shifted to logistical preparations for the upcoming landings rather than a reevaluation of Japanese capabilities on the island. Aboard the troop transports of the 1st Marine Division, the men who were closing in on Peleliu were briefed according to these reports. They were told to expect limited resistance from the air and a 4-day operation to capture the airfield. Many of these Marines were veterans of Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and other brutal campaigns. They understood that Japanese defenses were rarely simple. Still, Official statements emphasized confidence. The island, they were assured, had been pounded into submission. Yet Peleliu held secrets that U.S. planners had not uncovered. The airfield was not abandoned. It was active, supplied, and shielded by the island's rugged terrain. Japanese engineers and infantry had transformed the Ummerbrogal Ridge, an uncharted maze of coral outcrops, into one of the most complex defensive systems of the entire Pacific War. Beneath its ridgelines lay hundreds of interconnected caves, bunkers, and fortified firing positions, many invisible from the air. The aircraft based on the island were part of this deception. Rather than dispersing or appearing inactive by accident, Japanese commanders had deliberately minimized visible movement. Fueling operations, maintenance, and combat preparations were conducted under camouflage or near the jungle. Bombing raids that damaged the runway had been repaired quickly, often by night. As the American fleet steamed closer, the reality remained hidden. The Marines believed they were approaching an island already broken by air power. In truth, they were approaching a fully prepared stronghold, defended by experienced troops and supported by aircraft that were very much operational. The stage was set for a disaster that would have unfolded the moment those planes took flight had one pilot not uncovered the truth in time. Major Robert Cowboy Stout lifted off from the USS Hornet with the steadiness of a man who had completed dozens of similar flights. The mission profile was simple: maintain altitude, follow a straight path over northern Peleliu, and allow the automatic camera mounted beneath his F6F Hellcat to photograph the terrain below. The early stages of the flight offered nothing unusual. The sky was clear, visibility was ideal, and radio traffic from the fleet reflected the routine nature of the operation. As Stout approached the island, he positioned his aircraft for the first sweeping pass over the airfield. From altitude, the coral ridges and thick vegetation obscured much of the ground, but as he crossed into the airfield's airspace, the view beneath his wings shifted abruptly. What intelligence had identified as an abandoned runway was, in reality, a fully operational Japanese forward base. Through the canopy, Stout could see aircraft lined up wingtip to wingtip: Mitsubishi A6M0s, Nakajima B-5 and torpedo bombers, and other operational types rayed across the tarmac. Ground crews moved between them, loading fuel drums, preparing ordnance, and readying aircraft for flight. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not a dormant installation but a force preparing for a large-scale strike. The speed at which the danger became clear left little room for doubt. 40 aircraft, positioned for immediate launch, could devastate the transport ships and landing craft already moving toward Peleliu. Stout understood the implications instantly. The intelligence reports were wrong, and the invasion fleet was heading toward an air assault they did not expect. The calm routine of a reconnaissance mission dissolved into the realization that he was the only allied pilot witnessing a threat capable of altering the outcome of the entire operation. From the cockpit, the sight below was not simply alarming, it was a strategic disaster waiting to unfold. The sight of 40 fully armed Japanese aircraft forced Major Robert Stout into a decision few pilots ever faced. His orders had been explicit: conduct reconnaissance only, avoid engagement, return with photographic evidence. Disobeying such a directive in the U.S. Navy during 1944 carried severe consequences. A pilot who violated mission instructions risked court-martial, loss of rank, or immediate removal from flight status. For an aviator who had survived more than 60 combat missions, professional ruin was not an abstract threat, it was the likely outcome of deviating from orders. Yet the alternative was far worse. Stout knew what an attack force of this size could do. He had seen Japanese aircraft strike landing craft at Tarawa and other Pacific battlefields. Marines crowded into open, unarmored Higgins boats were effectively defenseless. A coordinated Japanese air assault at the moment of the Peleliu landings could produce catastrophic losses, potentially wiping out the first assault waves before they reached the shore. The troops approaching the island had no reason to expect such an attack. They were relying on the assumption that the airfield had been neutralized. Above the airfield, Stout held the only accurate intelligence on the threat. No other American aircraft were in position to verify what he was witnessing. Radioing the information back to the Hornet would take minutes. Assembling a strike group would take hours. In that time, the Japanese could disperse, conceal their aircraft, or launch immediately. Thousands of Marines, now less than 72 hours from hitting the beaches, depended on someone recognizing the danger in real time. The decision unfolded in isolation, at 8,000 feet, with no counsel, no second opinions, and no margin for hesitation. Everything Stout understood about military discipline urged him to follow orders. Everything he knew about combat told him the invasion force would suffer if he did. In the quiet of that cockpit, surrounded by the rising heat and movement on the ground below, he made his choice. He pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft carrying Major Robert Stout into Peleliu's airspace was one of the most influential fighters of the Pacific War, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. Introduced in 1943, the Hellcat had been designed with a single purpose, countering the Mitsubishi A6M0, the lightweight and highly maneuverable fighter that had dominated the early years of the Pacific Campaign. American pilots who first encountered the Zero described its turning ability, climb rate, and agility as unlike anything they had faced before. Its performance in 1941 and 1942 had given Japan near total air superiority. The Hellcat represented the United States' direct answer to that threat. Engineers at Grumman, informed by frontline pilot reports, sought not to replicate the Zero's characteristics, but to overcome them through superior power, durability, and firepower. The F6F was built around the 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R280 double Wasp engine, giving it exceptional climb and dive performance. Unlike the lightly built Zero, the Hellcat featured heavy armor plate, bullet-resistant glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks, features that dramatically increased pilot survivability. In terms of armament, the difference was even clearer. The Hellcat carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, providing a level of concentrated firepower capable of destroying a Zero within seconds. The Japanese counterpart, optimized for agility, carried lighter armament and lacked the structural strength to absorb damage. The Hellcat, by contrast, could take hits and remain functional, a crucial advantage in the harsh environment of carrier warfare. By mid-1944, these design choices had reshaped the air war. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcat pilots shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft, demonstrating the overwhelming effectiveness of the type. The F6F's performance, combined with improved American pilot training, had turned the tide decisively in favor of the U.S. Navy. For Stout, flying into Peleliu's airspace, these characteristics mattered. He was alone, outnumbered, and facing an entire airfield's worth of potential opposition. Engaging such a concentration of aircraft with any other fighter would have been unthinkable. Yet the Hellcat's rugged construction and firepower gave him a fighting chance. If he could strike first, accurately, and at the enemy's most vulnerable point, the aircraft had the capability to inflict catastrophic damage in a single pass. In the context of what Stout was about to attempt, the Hellcat was more than a dependable fighter. It was the product of lessons learned through years of hard combat, a machine engineered for resilience, aggression, and decisive action. At Peleliu, it would be pushed to its limits in a moment that its designers could never have predicted, but one for which the aircraft was uniquely suited. Major Robert Stout rolled his F6F Hellcat into a steep descent, dropping from altitude toward the northern edge of the Peleliu airfield. The decision to attack placed him immediately within range of the island's anti-aircraft defenses. Japanese gunners, momentarily caught off guard by the unexpected appearance of a single American fighter, diving at high speed, struggled to bring their weapons to bear. The first shells burst behind him, too late to disrupt his approach. Stout leveled out at extremely low altitude, using the terrain and speed of his aircraft to complicate the defender's aim. As he closed the distance, the key vulnerability on the airfield became unmistakable. Near the rows of parked aircraft stood clusters of 55-gallon fuel drum standard aviation stores that Japanese ground crews used to refuel fighters and bombers before takeoff. Concentrated so tightly together, they formed an accidental but highly volatile target. He positioned the Hellcat's gun sight not on an individual aircraft, but on the largest grouping of fuel containers. When he fired, all 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns released a dense stream of ammunition into the tarmac. The round struck the fuel drums, rupturing their thin metal walls and atomizing aviation gasoline. Within seconds, ignition occurred. The resulting explosion sent a column of flame upward, engulfing nearby aircraft and spreading burning fuel across the surface of the airfield. The initial blast triggered a rapid chain reaction. Parked Zeros and bombers, fueled and armed for departure, ignited in sequence. Ammunition aboard the aircraft began to cook off, producing secondary explosions that accelerated the destruction. Japanese ground crews attempted to scatter, some running for cover while others tried to reach anti-aircraft positions. But the expanding fire front outpaced any organized response. In the space of a single attack run, the quiet airfield transformed into a burning corridor of wreckage, an inferno visible across the island, signaling that the American reconnaissance flight had become something far more consequential. As Major Robert Stout pulled the Hellcat out of his first attack run, the air over Peleliu shifted instantly from shock to retaliation. Japanese anti-aircraft crews who had missed their chance moments earlier were now fully alert. Tracer rounds stitched upward from multiple positions, forming intersecting lines of fire that filled the sky beneath him. Black bursts of flak detonated at varying altitudes, the fragmentation intended to shred an aircraft passing through the blast radius. Stout banked hard, climbing just enough to reposition for a second approach. The damage from the first wave of explosions was already evident. His aircraft had taken hits along the fuselage and tail section. Vibration in the controls suggested structural stress or compromised control surfaces. Yet below him, on the southern portion of the airfield, additional Japanese aircraft remained intact. Ground crews were attempting to disperse them, pushing fighters toward revetments or moving equipment to protect bomber assets. If left untouched, these aircraft retained the potential to launch against the approaching invasion force. With limited time and fuel, Stout committed to a second run, descending again to low altitude. He entered the densest concentration of anti-aircraft fire he had yet faced. Tracer rounds passed close enough to flash across his canopy. Several struck the aircraft directly, the impacts resonating through the Hellcat's frame. Flak bursts erupted ahead of him, their smoke and shrapnel momentarily obscuring the runway and forcing split-second course adjustments. Still, the key target came into view. A fully loaded Japanese fuel truck positioned near a bomber being prepared for operations. Its proximity to aircraft and ammunition stores made it a critical vulnerability. Stout aligned the Hellcat and fired, directing what remained of his ammunition into the truck. The rounds penetrated the fuel tanks, causing a massive explosion that expanded outward, engulfing the nearby bomber. The force of the blast overturned the aircraft and ignited additional fuel and ordnance. The southern line of aircraft began to erupt in secondary detonations. Bomb racks, fuel lines, and ammunition stores ignited almost simultaneously, creating a series of concussive blasts that tore through the remaining operational planes. Fires spread rapidly, consuming equipment and rendering the area untenable for Japanese personnel attempting to mount a defense. As Stout passed over the last cluster of burning aircraft, he squeezed the trigger again. This time, the response was only a mechanical click. His ammunition was completely expended. In the sudden absence of gunfire, the cockpit fell quiet except for the engine's strained vibration and the continuing thud of flak detonations nearby. The airfield was now burning end to end. The danger that had threatened the invasion fleet moments earlier was collapsing under its own exploding fuel and munitions. But Stout, alone in a damaged aircraft and deep inside enemy airspace, still had to find a way out. Major Robert Stout climbed away from the airfield as the last of his ammunition ran dry. Beneath him, the northern and southern sections of the runway were engulfed in fire, with columns of black smoke rising thousands of feet into the air. The destruction he had initiated was visible across the entire northern end of Peleliu. But the moment he left the immediate threat below, a different danger made itself clear. The Hellcat was no longer responding like the aircraft he had launched with. The second attack run had inflicted significant damage. The control stick felt heavier, requiring more force to maintain stable flight. Rudder response was sluggish, an indication that the tail had taken hits or that control cables were partially compromised. Warning indicators on the instrument panel glowed where they had been dark only minutes earlier. Most concerning was the oil pressure gauge. The needle, which should have been steady, was starting to fall slowly at first, then in more noticeable increments. A drop in oil pressure for an aircraft powered by the R2800 Double Wasp was a serious warning. If the engine lost lubrication, it could seize entirely, turning the aircraft into a powerless glide long before reaching friendly waters. The adrenaline that had driven the attack began to fade. In its place came the stark recognition that survival was no longer guaranteed. Stout understood both the possibilities and the consequences. If he failed to return, The loss would be recorded as the disappearance of a pilot on a reconnaissance mission, an outcome no different from the many aviators lost across the Pacific. If he did return, questions about disobeyed orders and unauthorized engagement would await him. But the immediate challenge was neither judgment nor commendation. It was distance. The USS Hornet lay well offshore, beyond the island's coastal guns and miles of open water. The Hellcat had to stay airborne long enough to reach the carrier group and attempt a landing with compromised controls. Stout adjusted his heading toward the east, nursing the engine by keeping the throttle steady. Excessive power could accelerate oil loss. Too little could leave the aircraft unable to maintain altitude. He found a balance point, watching the gauges constantly. Every minute in the air became a calculation, monitoring temperature, pressure, engine vibration, and the rate of descent. The smoke from the airfield eventually receded behind him, replaced by the open expanse of the Pacific. The damaged Hellcat held together, but the uncertainty remained: whether the aircraft would survive the journey, whether the engine would continue running, and whether the landing gear could withstand touchdown were all unknowns. The attack was over. The battle for survival had just begun. As Major Robert Stout approached the American task force, the USS Hornet prepared for an emergency recovery. Carrier crews were trained for damaged aircraft returning from combat. But the condition of Stout's Hellcat became visible long before he reached the ship. Smoke trailed intermittently from the engine cowling. The tail section, riddled with holes from 20mm fire, appeared twisted and unstable. Signal officers on deck immediately notified the bridge that the returning aircraft was severely compromised. Procedures shifted quickly. The carrier turned into the wind, increasing airflow across the deck to give Stout the best possible chance of arresting safely. Non-essential aircraft were cleared from the landing area. Fire crews, crash teams, and rescue personnel took their positions, anticipating the possibility of a gear collapse or structural failure on touchdown. The stakes were clear. A damaged aircraft landing on a crowded carrier deck could result in a catastrophic chain reaction if fuel ignited or debris impacted parked aircraft. Inside the cockpit, Stout faced another uncertainty. His landing gear indicators showed a partial lock. One wheel appeared secure, but the other gave no confirmation. If the gear collapsed on impact, the aircraft could cartwheel or slide uncontrollably across the deck. With hydraulic pressure fluctuating and control response deteriorating, he had no option except to attempt the landing and hope the structure held. As he approached the deck, the landing signal officer guided him with precise gestures. The Hellcat came in higher and faster than ideal, the damage limiting Stout's ability to fine-tune his descent. When the aircraft hit the deck, the impact was violent. The resting hook caught the second wire, halting the aircraft abruptly and throwing Stout forward in his harness. The force of the stop buckled damaged metal, and for a moment flames licked from the exhaust as the engine struggled against its failing. Lubrication. Deck crews rushed in immediately. The extent of the damage became unmistakable. Up close, the tail was shredded, control surfaces were torn through, and large caliber impacts had punched holes across the fuselage. The aircraft bore the unmistakable signature of heavy anti-aircraft fire, far more than any reconnaissance mission should have encountered. Officers arrived within moments. Confusion turned to anger as they examined the state of the plane. A mission intended to gather photographs had resulted in an aircraft returning with extensive combat damage. The air boss, squadron leaders, and intelligence officers demanded an explanation. Stout's orders had been clear. His aircraft told a completely different story. The confrontation that followed would determine whether he faced commendation or court-martial. In the immediate aftermath of the landing, Major Robert Stout faced pointed questions from the Hornet's command staff. His mission briefing had been unambiguous: conduct reconnaissance only. Yet his Hellcat bore the unmistakable marks of a pilot who had engaged an entire airfield. Intelligence officers, relying on earlier assessments that described Peleliu's air strength as negligible, were skeptical. They pressed him for clarification, attempting to reconcile his report with the existing intelligence picture. The key to resolving the dispute lay not in testimony, but in evidence. During his first attack run, the automated reconnaissance camera mounted in Stout's aircraft had continued to operate, although it had not captured the entire sequence. The early frames provided clear imagery of parked Japanese aircraft moments before the explosion. The camera film was rushed below deck for development. When the photographs emerged, they showed rows of fighters and bombers in operational condition aircraft that were supposed to have been destroyed or abandoned. The images supported Stout's account, and directly contradicted the intelligence summaries that had guided pre-invasion planning. Still, photographs taken during a high-speed dive could not fully quantify the destruction. The definitive confirmation arrived the following day, when additional reconnaissance flights were dispatched over Peleliu. This second set of images, captured under controlled conditions, revealed the full extent of the damage. The northern airfield was a field of charred wreckage. Burned-out frames of Mitsubishi Zeros and Nakajima bombers lay scattered across the tarmac. Fuel stores were obliterated. Hangars and support structures showed signs of massive blast damage. A final count estimated that approximately 40 Japanese aircraft had been rendered inoperable, effectively eliminating the island's air threat. With the photographic record indisputable, the tone aboard the Hornet shifted. Speculation about disciplinary action gave way to recognition of an extraordinary tactical achievement. Stout's actions had neutralized a force capable of inflicting devastating losses on the invasion fleet. Shortly afterward, the formal commendation process began. Stout was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for combat valor. The citation acknowledged his extraordinary heroism in attacking a vastly superior enemy force alone, preventing an imminent threat to the landing force. 3 days later, when the 1st Marine Division approached the beaches of Peleliu, they encountered fierce ground resistance, but no Japanese aircraft rose to challenge them. The skies above the invasion were silent, cleared by a single pilot in an 8-minute attack that reshaped the opening hours of the battle. 3 days after Stout's attack, the 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu and entered one of the most brutal engagements of the Pacific War. The island's interior, dominated by the Ummerbrogel Ridge, concealed a dense network of defensive positions, more than 500 interconnected caves, tunnels, and fortified strongpoints engineered by approximately 10,000 Japanese defenders. Unlike earlier battles marked by banzai charges, Peleliu featured a deliberate, attritional defense strategy. Japanese forces withdrew into hardened positions and made the Marines fight for every ridge and crevice. Casualties mounted quickly. By the end of the campaign, the 1st Marine Division suffered over 6,500 casualties, including nearly 2,000 killed, astonishing figures for an island only 6 miles long. The intensity of the fighting led many veterans to describe Peleliu as one of the harshest and most unforgiving battles they had ever faced. Yet the invasion began without the disaster that had nearly occurred. Post-war analyses by military historians estimated that if the Japanese aircraft on Peleliu had launched as planned, they could have inflicted catastrophic losses on the landing force, possibly killing hundreds of Marines in the vulnerable first hours. Some estimates place the number of lives saved by Stout's preemptive strike between 500 and 1,000. The Marines who hit the beaches fought fiercely and suffered terribly, but they never faced the aerial assault that might have shattered the landing. Before it began, most never knew why. They only knew the skies above them were clear, and the man responsible remained unknown to them. After the war, Robert Cowboy Stout returned to California and resumed civilian life with little fanfare. Like many veterans of the Pacific, he rarely spoke publicly about his experiences. The Navy Cross he received for his actions on September 12 remained tucked away, not displayed prominently or used to draw attention. His reluctance reflected a broader trend among service members, who regarded their wartime actions as duty rather than personal achievement. Stout's decision over Peleliu, however, has continued to shape military thinking. His actions are often cited in discussions of initiative at the tactical level, where split-second judgment by individuals on the front line can alter operational outcomes. Stout had disobeyed a direct order, but his actions aligned with the broader strategic objective of protecting the invasion force. This principle, known as commander's intent, emphasizes understanding the purpose of a mission, rather than rigid adherence to procedure when circumstances shift dramatically. Modern military academies study Stout's attack for its clarity of judgment, its exploitation of enemy vulnerabilities, and its demonstration of tactical courage under extreme pressure. His 8-minute strike stands as one of the most effective solo actions in naval aviation history. His story endures as a reminder that heroism is often quiet, uncelebrated, and carried out by individuals who act not for recognition, but because the moment demands it.